Gunter Munkayo, who is the Economic and Trade Policy Advisor at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung from Germany, to join us on the stage, please. Now may I invite our speakers, Ms. Dulciana Somare Brash, Development Specialist, DevCom Pacific from Papua New Guinea, to join us on stage. Ms. Janvi Tripathi, Associate Fellow with the Observer Research Foundation. Mr. Raimund Bleiswitch, Scientific Director at the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research, Professor Global Sustainable Resources at the University of Bremen from Germany. Mr. Renato Flores, Director of the International Intelligence Unit at the FGV from Brazil, and Ambassador Witold Sobko, Minister Plenipotentiary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland. Thank you so much, dear speakers and moderator, for joining us today. And now may I hand it over to Gunter to take us through the proceedings. Over to you, Gunter.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So I thought that I should introduce myself, but thank you that you already did this for me. I can skip this part, and so it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this vital discussion on new routes for new resources. Today we examine a transformative challenge of our time: how to reshape global infrastructure and trade routes to meet the demands of the 21st century, driven by the critical minerals essential for clean energy and technological advancement. Oh. Okay. The world is experiencing an unprecedented demand for minerals like lithium, nickel, cobalt, and raw earth elements, materials critical for technologies ranging from batteries and wind turbines to semiconductors and electric vehicles. Some regions are at the forefront of this shift, with abundant mineral reserves and growing potential for value-added processing. For instance, Latin America holds over 50% of global lithium reserves, while Southeast Asia dominates nickel production, with Indonesia leading globally in output. However, much of these regions' potential remains untapped due to logistical challenges, environmental concerns, and gaps in international collaboration. In the conference booklet, you can find the key questions that guide our discussion today. We want to talk about reshaping connectivity paradigms, lessons for inclusive growth, financing and investment, and private sector preparedness. Efforts to secure critical mineral supply chains are already reshaping global trade dynamics. For example, Indonesia's export ban on raw nickel ore has driven massive domestic processing investments, but also sparked geopolitical debates. And with so much at stake, economic growth, energy transition goals, and global stability, the time to act is now. So let us dive into these issues with our distinguished panelists that were already introduced to you. And so we can jump right into it, Dulciana, and let me ask you about your home country, about Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea exports many of the critical minerals I just mentioned in my introduction, or some of them at least. And as an island nation, your country also has the huge advantage of direct access to the sea. How is Papua New Guinea taking advantage of these opportunities, and what obstacles needs to be taken into account?
Thank you, Gunter. I must explain that Papua New Guinea sits in the Southwest Pacific. We have a population of about 17 million people, we think. We haven't had a national census since about 2010. Our main obstacle, and there are quite a few, when you consider development, when you consider trade, everything is urgent in Papua New Guinea at the moment. We're very close to Australia, so we're an hour on a plane to Cairns in Queensland in Australia. To the largest cities, we average, it's about 3 hours. The biggest problems that we face are possibly institutional incapacity. So infrastructure development and the importance of transport routes becomes very critical. We're 50 years since independence, we'll be 50 years next year. Again, speaking of the obstacles that are faced in Papua New Guinea, if we're listing from macroeconomic to development challenges to defence and trade, we have a liquidity crisis, we have foreign exchange issues, we have a unicameral system of parliament, we are a parliamentary democracy. Extractive industries between petroleum and minerals contribute about 24% to our GDP. We're about a $36 billion economy. We should be a $3 trillion economy, but for some of the challenges that we face, and I think transport infrastructure is key amongst them. We also face fuel storage problems. So it's difficult to travel domestically. Our transport connectivity is poor to weak to non-existent at best. And we have been experiencing the challenges of exponential population growth. So we think about 3.8% exponential population growth. Now, when you add that to a development context where everything is urgent and we are geopolitically in a very strategic position in the Pacific, and the world is coming to us. So the urgency and the demand for our critical minerals, particularly I think cobalt and nickel, we do have gold, gas, oil, and many other mineral deposits. But I think the critical minerals are, I think the demand for semiconductors is the highest at the moment, and we're challenged by some geopolitical issues. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Let me then hand over to Janvi from ORF, because we talked a little bit earlier, and you mentioned that India has entered into several partnerships with resource-rich countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil. And what strategy is India pursuing with these strategies, and how can these partnerships be successful?
Thank you for the question. I will say it's very early to judge whether they've been successful or not in terms of partnerships. But I think what's happening with our partnerships on critical mineral supply specifically is that they are not currently at an elevated track 1 level. They're happening more at a decentralized level. The larger partnerships that we are doing on critical minerals are the mineral security partnerships specifically, and the Mineral Security Finance Network, which is a US-led initiative. And what's interesting about the MSP is that a lot of the members are G20 members, so of course we had that going for us last year, which spiraled into a sort of supply chain conversation as well, and securitizing our supply chains. On the question of how we are handling supply chain resilience and how we're trying to ensure that supply risks are reduced for critical minerals, in India it is important specifically because of our own growth agenda. The ESDM sector and green technologies are both implicated by the availability of critical minerals, and there is an overconcentration issue on critical minerals. The overconcentration in specific geographies, there is an overconcentration of processing technology, and getting those technologies into newer markets is important not just for India, but overall from a sector-wide ecosystem perspective, it is important to have a sort of democratized access to these processing technologies, because it will not just impact the value chain, but also impact the jobs of the future, our green transition. So keeping all that in mind, the kind of partnerships that we pursue in the near term, in the next 5 to 10 year term, will determine how successful we are in securing a green future for ourselves, if nothing else, which is kind of a conundrum given critical minerals themselves are not always accessible in green and clean fashions. So finding those green ways to access critical minerals, even as we find new technologies to use them in, it is the kind of tightrope that policymakers will have to walk in the coming years, I think.
Thank you. And before I continue, just a technical note. I I think that we have a little bit of difficulties of understanding each other here on the panel. So maybe if somebody could, I don't know, move some buttons or so, that would help us a lot. But let me nevertheless continue with Raimund. Raimund, the demand for critical minerals will continue to grow. To meet this demand, many strategies, such as the European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act, rely on recycling as well as extraction. We have done a lot of research on circular economy. What role do you think the circular economy can play in the area of critical minerals?
Thanks a lot. It's a highly interesting role, I would say, and perhaps I should say a word of what a circular economy is about. It's a type of economy that seeks to close the loops from a linear to a more circular economy, so that there is a reuse of materials, they are kept in the economy. And this has typically two advantages. One is to lower the import bill, in particular for resource dependent, for resource importing countries. And the second is to contribute to decarbonization, because the International Resource Panel and others estimate that there is a lowering of some 30% of greenhouse gas emission with the secondary route. So that sounds interesting. And if we now look a bit at India, all the ambitious plans that we heard about to invest in ports and shipping, that will mean additional demand for resources, for sure, for concrete, for steel, and for the critical materials. And the demand for critical materials, as they are applied in high-tech and green transition technologies, is expected to triple, to become fivefold over the next 10 or 20 years. So there's an urgent demand to look for new strategies, be it partnerships, be it more sustainable mining or circular economy. So the advantages for India to engage in this type of more circular economy would be to lower the import bill, which I understand is year by year more than $200 billion net import bill, not for critical materials, but for all sorts of materials, and indeed to reap the advantages of contributing to decarbonization. One of the materials I would like just to mention here is steel, because it is next to concrete, the most carbon-intensive material. It will be required. So having a closer loop for scrap steel, for secondary steel, to me is the natural advantage of India, which is why I was pleased to see the engagement in ship recycling, which is highly consistent, high-quality steel. So ramping this up is definitely in the strong interest of a circular economy. There's an interaction here with the electricity system, because the electric arc furnace technology requires then green electricity. And that is something that would need to be delivered as soon as possible, but I understand this is an interaction that indeed will be addressed. The second then is the critical materials themselves. Globally, they have a circularity rate of just 1%. So 99% of those materials are still wasted because they are crushed and incinerated as part of electronic waste treatment, or go to landfill where the toxic substances are released. So developing or applying and gradually improving the circularity of critical materials is absolutely essential in my view. So from 1% to 100% is a long way to go, and we may never be able to achieve it, but going from 1% to 10% to 20, 30%, that is something that the European Union is aspiring to, and I would think that's doable for India too, given all the capability that exists. So roadmap for the circularity of criticality is useful, and there's a role for ports here to play, because they are imported and the electronic goods are then re-imported as waste. So establishing green ports with an industrial cluster to recapture and reuse critical materials, that is to me part of the agenda. But let me also name one more thing as an end here. The partnerships that have been mentioned by John V. There could also be partnerships for secondary materials, Because the more countries move into a circular economy, the more there will be a competitive advantage from those who can maintain and manage a second life for batteries, for instance. So that is something that can be developed along with the recapturing, and the more partnerships exist there in the Pacific, say India and Papua New Guinea and Germany or European Union, the more the better. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Renato, this conference is all about the ocean and the blue economy. So when we talk about critical minerals and the ocean, I think we need to talk about one of the elephants in the room, and that is seabed mining. On the ocean floor, we can find polymetallic nodules, cobalt-rich crusts, and massive sulfide deposits. How do you view these opportunities that lie in seabed mining?
Thank you. Well, good evening to the remaining heroes. I'll try to address these points in a in a more general way. I think the Global South should think better that mining is the first step in a value chain. So the first thing to do, I think, in a general terms, is to consider if one is going to do something after. Mining is very preliminary. Usually you have one or two processing steps. And this is very important because this makes a big difference. This is one point. The second point is the logistics. Well, we are talking about sea lanes. Out of whatever will come this critical mineral, it will get into a logistic chain which nowadays, in terms of sea lanes, is controlled by oligopolies. So this is another point. Are we going to continue to rely on these oligopolies, which, by the way, they work very well broadly? Or are we going to create, as Global South, other firms, other ways to transport these critical minerals? Also, if we think about sea lanes, I think it's time to start to look at the world from the Spielhaus projection, which I don't know whether everybody who's here knows. It's a way of fixing in the Antarctic and turning the globe around so that you see the whole mass of a unified oceans. We should look, ponder and wonder at the Spielhaus projections, because we need new innovative sea lanes to transport critical materials. Otherwise, we are going to create additional stress on the usual choke points. I'm not going to name them. Everybody has heard them many times during this conference. And also, I would say that the canals of Panama and Suez will soon be with overcapacity. So we must think seriously if you want a Global South participation in critical minerals extraction, that this is going to be a problem. We are going to create stress, new traffic in areas which are already close to overcapacity. And finally, I would like to remind something which I mentioned in the other panel, the importance of joint ventures. If we are talking about critical minerals, and especially if we start also to exploit the seabed, where we know at least 5 important critical minerals, it's important not to do this alone, but to start to conceive joint ventures with an open mind, either among Global South countries or joining with developing countries which have the technology, because the technology in mining critical minerals is very important, and we also need this knowledge. So these are a few points I would like to suggest for creating a framework for a decision on improving our share and improving our participation in the critical minerals exploitation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I already noticed that some of the panelists want to react to this, but I would ask you to just hold your thought for a second, because I also want to bring Witold into our discussion here. And some of the aspects that Renato mentioned, South-South cooperation, so already point towards some geopolitical aspects, and that's why I want to ask you about the European Union's Critical Raw Materials Act that I mentioned already. When President von der Leyen proposed this act in March of 2023, the European Union was heavily dependent on China, with import rates up to 98% in the case of processed rare earth elements. So it was, and it is, primarily about de-risking vis-à-vis China. Is the European Union on the right track here, Witold?
Thank you, Günther. Yes, let me say a few words about the European Union and also about Poland, what we are doing at the moment in this respect. I think the pandemic was a catalyst for us in the European Union. It was not just about rare earth minerals, because, of course, before the pandemic, we had known that we need rare earth minerals for batteries, chips, engines, magnets, wind turbines, etc. But the pandemic made us realize that we really depend on one country in many respects, or one provider, or even one company, when you look at Taiwan, for example, and chips. And it made us realize that we should think perhaps not narrowly only about the rare earth minerals, but we should think about a list of critical materials, like active ingredients for the pharmaceutical industry, for example. This is also critical, because if you don't have them, and 70% of them come from one country, you cannot produce even simple medicines. So it was a catalyst, and in the European Union, as you know, we like to regulate, and we decided to regulate. You have mentioned the Act. Let me just say very briefly, for those who have not read the Act, as it's a long document, so just a few words on this. But we have identified 34 critical materials, out of which 17 are strategic. And the goal to put our house in order is 2030. And by 2030, when it comes to extraction, we want the minimum of the minimum of 10% should come from the European Union. As far as processing is concerned, the minimum of 40% should be done in the European Union. Recycling, the minimum is 25%, and when it comes to external sources, not more than 65% of those critical materials or resources should come from one country. So we want diversification. And what I mentioned before, from different countries should provide us critical materials, and also diversification from one company is not a good thing. China was mentioned here, but in fact, if you look at the European Union, we get those critical resources from many places, and China is not number one. Australia is number one. And the USA is number two, then Brazil, then Indonesia, Peru, and then China, and Russia is the last one. So when it comes to critical resources, Australia is number one. It's 4.7 billion euro. When it comes to Poland, of course, we are also a mining nation. As you know, we have coal, we have lignite. We don't have many minerals that we need, like lithium or tungsten or nickel, etc. We have copper. But we need more. We need more from either from our deposits, and this is what we decided to do, to explore what we can get in Poland, maybe more of what we have, or maybe we can discover some new deposits. And also, in this context, we wanted to ensure that private investment could come to Poland, private investors would have proper climate to invest in Poland in this. But also, of course, the EU means also due diligence, environmental standards, etc. So in our legislation, we want to ensure that everything is done properly. We have two basic documents. One is Poland's policies in energy 2040, and another one is Poland's ecological policies 2030. So everything is written in those two documents, how we want to respect environmental standards, sustainable development, things of this kind. And to finish, since the conference is on oceans, let me say that we are also interested in seabed mining. Of course, with the respect to international law, especially UNCLOS, we signed an agreement, a 15-year contract with the International Seabed Authority to search for polymetallic sulfides. So we are mostly in the mid-Atlantic ridge, not in the Indian Ocean, but in the mid-Atlantic ridge, and we want to concentrate on polymetallic sulfides. It's a contract for 15 years. I would stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe seabed mining is the right word to give the word to you, Raimund, because I know that this might be a topic that you want to contribute, and you also wanted to jump into the discussion when Renato was talking about new forms of cooperation.
I'll make it short because people wanted probably to jump in here. So on deep seabed mining, it is a very contested issue, and I'm on the side of those who is more skeptic, because any technology that has been under development so far will come with strong environmental impacts, and even if you look at sort of things that could just be picked up, it will have distortions into the deep seabed on the microorganisms, the carbon that is in there, so severe impact, I hesitate. What I find interesting in regard to what Renato has said, and it's probably food for thought over the dinner here, is what is happening in commodity trade over the next 10, 20 years, under the assumption that Paris Agreement will more or less deliver, maybe slower, but it will probably mean less trade with oil, with coal, and with iron ore, because these are all about to be decarbonized, less meaning, less compared to business as usual. So there's more capacity compared to current planning, and if we then compare those critical materials, they are lightweight. I compared, for instance, iron ore volume in trade with the volume in those critical materials, and there's a factor of 40 between the more lightweight critical materials and the more bulky iron ore. So there's capacity. To me, the route and the proposed scenario would then be that the more we engage in international trade and all the energy transition goods that come with it, there's an opportunity for smarter logistics and also for South-South global trade, but also for more value-added goods compared with the bulky commodities that typically have a low value at the beginning of the value chain. Just some food for thought. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. In a while, the audience can prepare, because in 2 or 3 minutes we will open the floor also for questions from the audience. But I see Renato that wants to comment on that.
Just Just 1 minute to maybe clarify a few points. First, innovative cooperation in terms of Global South is a cooperation in which you get a larger share of value added. That's it. I'm not sure if this has been taking place, and the question of processing is crucial. That's why I mention it. The second point is that demand for critical minerals has been increasing. So for sure, if we want to supply this demand, there will be a stress on sea lanes. There will be increased traffic on this. And I think this is important. And finally, not necessarily for coping or for realizing this, you need South-South partnerships. I think this is important. There is no discrimination. You can also have North-South partnerships, which, if I understood well, I don't know whether I understood well Raymond's argument. The experience until now, it's not very encouraging. It's not bad, but it's not very encouraging. And I would say it must be improved. That's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one example of new forms of partnerships could be also the partnership that Papua New Guinea has with Australia. But maybe, or I know that you wanted also to add some context to the discussion we're having here. So, Dulciana.
Thank you, Gunther. Yes, I really wanted to add some context here in relation to a developing jurisdiction where vast natural resources is a gift to our nation, a naturally occurring one. COVID taught us many things, how the world stopped talking to each other, how it travelled differently, how it communicated with each other. And I think lots of conversations were taken online and then offline. When you look at critical minerals, for us, we have large Chinese investments in nickel and cobalt. We don't have the capacity to manufacture to on-stream processing. And that's because of a few issues. I think institutional incapacity, but also law and order. We have our risk profile is quite low. Foreign direct investment, therefore, has been minimal. We have about 6 high-impact projects that could be converted, but for the fact that we have state negotiating teams. So within that, the capacity range is quite embedded in our internal experience, which is separate from the aspirations of government to develop these resources and therefore share the benefits with our people. We have high-level constitutional and legislative and regulatory protections that protect our Indigenous rights to land and sea also. The main issue there is the policing. For instance, we have a gold mine and a cobalt and mineral mine. In a gold mine called Wafi Golpu, it's a special mining lease, which is a criteria for the extractive to happen over 20 years to produce about 75 million kina per annum. In this new gold mine, we require robotics. We produce the raw minerals in our country, but we're not able to actually lock down the supply chains because we don't have the manufacturing capabilities. We don't have the primary, secondary, tertiary markets for reinvestments domestically when you consider that there are large superannuation funds flushed with liquidity with no place to reinvest. Australia's partnership with Papua New Guinea, there's a good model in ports where a financial product acknowledges the shift in the partnership from Papua New Guinea becoming a partner with Australia. Australia has the social licence to operate in Papua New Guinea at subnational level, and that means social safeguards, that means environmental safeguards, that means borrowings that the Papua New Guinea government guarantees, and the debt stock is passed on to an SOE called the PNG ports, where investments in the tidal basin are basically setting us up for our geostrategic, geoeconomic and geopolitical future. In just the last 18 months, the big powers have come to Papua New Guinea, and I think the negotiations on those terms will really have to shift from the philosophy of development and really understand the importance of context and what we can do and the difference between what we would like to do. So I think there are good models in the region, and the reality is understanding we have huge cultural limitations because access to land is not something that's certain. We need to reduce the cost of energy from 40 cents per kilowatt hour down to about 9 cents so that we can extract sand for concrete factories that can build our steel industries to use our raw materials and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you very much for this context. I saw a lot of nodding, so it was very helpful to frame our discussion here on the panel. But as I mentioned earlier, I would like to invite the audience to also raise questions. If you want to do so, please step to the microphone, say your name and affiliation. And if the question is directed to one of the panelists specifically, please say so. I saw there are already 3 hands, so maybe these 3, oh, they're all gentlemen. Well, nevertheless, the 3 gentlemen, please. We will collect these 3 questions and then answer here, and if we have more time, we can also allow more questions. But the first 3 questions, please.
Yeah, good evening to all the panelists. I am Nishit and I am a student of International Relations at South Asian University. So my question to the panel is, like, recently there was the Arctic Mining Report 2024, where Arctic is seen as, like the melting ice basically in the Arctic is seen as very critical for the raw materials, critical raw materials, and as well as for the transportation of critical minerals. But on the other hand, the melting snow, as we all know, is an environmental catastrophe, especially for the coastal areas. So I want to know the views of the panel, like how do we balance, how this thing is going to be balanced? Like on the one hand, the melting ice is seen as an opportunity, but on the other hand, it is an environmental catastrophe.
Okay, thank you. Then we collect the next question, please.
My name is Manish Chand. I'm CEO Center for Global India Insights. It's a think tank. My question is, given the uneven distribution of critical minerals, is there a case for critical minerals to be regarded as global commons? Number one. Number two, there seems to be a new scramble for critical minerals, what some have called a form of neo-colonialism emerging. China has a major competitive edge, is going around the world buying mines and critical minerals extraction and all that. Is there a neo-colonialism in process? What does it mean for mineral security for the rest of the world? Thank you.
And one third question, and then we go first to the answers, and then we can allow maybe one more question or 2 more questions, please.
Hi, I'm Chamira from Sri Lanka. My question is actually directed to Janvi and the panel in general. India is becoming the 2nd largest economy, third largest, and the second is obviously China. You guys are neighbors, we are in the neighborhood. So what does geopolitics and geopolitical rivalry play in critical mineral extraction, and how do you foresee this challenge being, addressed, especially from Indian perspective? Is there a role for diplomacy, or how do you intend to navigate these turbulent times? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for these 3 concise questions. Before we hand over to you, the first question was about Arctic mining and how to balance environmental risk. So I guess it's a similar case as with the seabed mining. I don't know if somebody can add something to the case of Arctic mining as well.
I'm certainly in favor of protecting the Arctic. That's my view. I see good reasons for it. It is a common heritage of mankind, the Arctic, and even if it is now melting, that does not mean we should spur the mining there. In particular, given that there are alternatives like having a better extraction of the Papua New Guinea type of land governance systems and the circular economy. On the global commons, that was also asked, whether one should look at the stores, the mines of critical materials as a global common. I hesitate to do so because it's territory. That's a question of sovereignty, and it would be hard for any country to accept it as a global common. What I would rather think of is that the exploration can be better coordinated, some transparency and publication of the data of the exploration, and then a better coordination of the mining and the investments into it. That's more a question of a club, say those who are interested and willing to invest, and those who are able to offer the materials to the market, that they could come together. It's a club of 40, 50 countries or so. India would be part of them, and many others too. Rivalry, that's another issue. I strongly believe in cooperation.
Yeah, and we also have to keep in mind that even if the resources are unevenly distributed, a lot of the value adding is happening in the processing, right? And there we already see that not necessarily the countries with the resources are the ones that process the materials. But has somebody else to comment on the question of global commons, neocolonialism? Because otherwise I would hand over to Janvi for the third question concerning India.
Yes, I also had a comment on the global commons question, but I think that was covered. I do want to briefly address the Arctic mining report, just because the Arctic is melting and it is helping along the economy doesn't mean we should help the Arctic melt, right? It shouldn't become an economic imperative that we help the Arctic melt, just because we're finding economic use out of it. So perhaps we should keep that in mind and be very careful when we're discussing economic use of what is a very negative impact of climate change. On the question of India's economic rivalries and partnerships, I'm conscious of time really quickly. India's approach to partnerships on mineral security has been to look at like-minded partners. The ambassador mentioned that there's 33 critical minerals listed in the EU Critical Materials Act. India has identified 30 odd of their own. There are overlaps. There are ways to find common ground on where we should be getting these resources from, how we should be getting them. There's also the matter of India acting as a bridge between the global north and south. I know South-South cooperation was discussed, but we are trying to make sure that we don't become a neo-colonial enterprise, and that was part of the questions. And that can only happen if we partner with those countries which have these natural resources, coming back to the point on respect for sovereignty. Because these are, at the end of the day, resources that add value to economies, and to make that a global common would be a disservice to the economies that have been gifted these lands and these resources.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have like 1 minute left for the questions. So if you are very, very quick and concise, then we can...
Yeah, Professor Flores. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, Professor Flores. Yeah. We are talking of...
Stop. I will first hand over to the left side, because we had now 3 questions from the right side. So first on the left side, the gentleman, and then we will go back to the right side.
Yeah, thank you for the democratization of the question answer session. Very briefly, I was a former career civil servant, so I just want to raise a nuance. You know, the next frontier is on the seabed mining. It's under the aegis of the ISA. Now, I've heard conversations about the fact that you need to have a smart logistic network, but honestly, I don't see any conversation with the maritime transport sector really happening currently, which is a shame and a pity, because at the end of the day, you need a certain typology of vessels that you need to identify for this purpose. And I dare say that none of this is happening. For example, dynamic positioning vessels and the deep sea diving vessels that you need to have. Do we have an assessment of what that profile could look like? And I would very strongly urge that you need to have this conversation. The final point, very rapidly, is to say that there's a major maritime security nuance to this entire paradigm. Please understand that critical mineral resources are high stakes game, and you will have a major resource-based geopolitical scenarios unfolding. And that, simply put, means you could have situations where extractions takes place. In transportation, you can have tailgating of vessels, and you could have non-state and state actors who could probably completely scupper the transportation logistics supply chain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
the two gentlemen are standing there.
Yeah, Professor Flores, the way we are talking of critical matters, minerals, and do we have the names of the minerals what we have, and do we have the technology how to extract it? Similarly, minerals, we have a flora and fauna also that can be also extracted from oceans. Thank you.
And okay, this if you manage to pose your question within 10 seconds, then you can both raise the question.
Yes,
Thank you.
okay. I think my intervention is very useful to illustrate the role of Suez Canal and in the supporting world trade. As my colleague said that there is restriction on the Suez Canal, I would like to say Suez Canal can handle more than 97 vessels per day, and the last 10 years we do a lot of a project to support world trade, and now after the next year we will handle more than 103 vessels per day. The political issues in the region is the problem of decline the number of vessels, but Suez Canal have a good situation. We have overcapacity to attract more vessels and to use the Suez Canal.
I'm very, very sorry.
So there is no restriction on the Suez
I'm very,
Canal.
very sorry, but
okay.
In order to let the last gentleman also,
Thank you.
I'll have to interrupt you. I think we got the message.
K.K. Roy Chaudhary, Environment and Energy Consultant in Indian cement industry. My question to any of the panelists or all the panelists regarding one particular critical mineral, that's lithium. As we understand, value addition in the countries that are blessed with this particular mineral, for example, would enhance their marketability of this particular mineral. Are these countries have any preparedness for processing at their own sources? If so, if there is any deployment already? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, we cannot go into the detail of the processing of every resource because there was one question very broad about very different kinds. We would have to leave this for the next break. But if anybody wants to answer maybe the last question on lithium, because it was the most precise.
Well, there are a few countries that are currently the main providers, like Bolivia and a few others, and there's potential around Cornwall Coast and others. But lithium is indeed essential for electric vehicles and batteries. So what I would like to conclude with is that there is a chance for a partnership here on the panel with like the EU and Brazil and India, and I would say Papua New Guinea as a sort of smaller country that so far has been suffering from a resource curse, like Bolivia. So there's a good chance to cooperate and then indeed to shift some of the value added to those countries to apply the lessons learned in resource governance and make this world a better place to end with.
Okay.
It's a global statement. I think the last few questions, you touch a very big problem. We are not going to solve it here. The point is that mining is one of the most polluting activities and one of the most damaging activities to the environment if performed on land, and if performed on the seabed, we don't know yet, but probably it will cause also a lot of trouble.
Renato.
So the big question is the following. The one who mines pays the price and sells for a low price the output, or does it internalize a bit of value added by performing more operations? This is a very old problem,
Renato.
not only related to critical mining, and it's not going to be solved here, but I would like to say that it's on, and it must be considered one day.
Great, Renato, thank you very much, because this last sentence saved me from the duty of giving some form of summary, because it was a very great closing sentence. And with this, I hand over to the staff of SAGARMANTHAN.
A big round of applause to the panel, please. Thank you so much, Gunter, for the moderation, Dulciana, Janvi, Raymond, Renato, Ambassador Whitall. Thank you so much for joining us today and an excellent conversation. If I could just invite you to the front of the stage for a quick photograph. So as Renato